It wasn't the bullet. It was never the bullet. You've been watching the wrong thing your entire life. Every Western ever made pointed you at the gun, at the duel, at the moment of violence that could be filmed and scored and turned into something that felt like justice. Meanwhile, the real killers were invisible. They were in the water, in the food, in the air inside the bunkhouse, in the slow destruction of a body pushed past its limits, for months at a time with nothing to recover on and nowhere to stop. Today we're going through them one by one, the things that actually killed cowboys in the American Wild West. Not the dramatic version, the real one, the documented one, the one that the dime novels and the Hollywood studios spent 150 years making sure you never thought about. And by the end of this, you're going to understand something that changes the entire picture. The Wild West wasn't dangerous because of gunfighters. It was dangerous because of everything else. Let's start with the water. Every cowboy on every cattle drive in the history of the American West faced the same daily problem. He needed water, clean water, water that wouldn't put him on the ground within 48 hours of drinking it. And the frontier, vast and open and cinematically beautiful as it was, offered almost no guarantee that the water he found was safe. The rivers and creeks that crossed the cattle trail routes were not the clean, rushing water of landscape paintings. They were working waterways in a working landscape. Thousands of cattle moved through them. Upstream contamination was not a concept that most men on the trail thought about in any systematic way, because the germ theory of disease, the basic scientific understanding that bacteria in water caused illness, was barely accepted by the medical establishment in 1873 and had not filtered down into the practical knowledge of a 20-year-old cowboy from Tennessee, deciding whether to drink from a creek. He looked at the water. It looked like water. He drank. Cholera worked by stripping the body of fluids faster than anything available in the period could replace them. The cramps arrived first, without warning, with an intensity that stopped whatever you were doing immediately and completely. Then the fever, then the shaking, then the eyes sinking back into the skull as the body emptied itself. A man could be riding at dawn and dead by nightfall, not weakened, not sick, in a way that suggested survival with rest. Dead, completely and finally, and without the dramatic arc that illness in films always provides. Some men lasted hours. Dysentery was slower and in many ways worse. It moved through cattle drive camps with the efficiency of a disease that had evolved specifically for exactly these conditions. Men living in close quarters, sharing water sources, with no sanitation infrastructure of any kind. Their immune systems already compromised by months of inadequate nutrition and physical overuse. A man with dysentery could not ride, could not work, could not do anything except endure, in full view of everyone around him, a process that was neither private nor dignified nor brief. Trail bosses budgeted for it, not in any written policy, in the practical mathematics of how long a drive would take and how many men would be functional at any given point. Illness was not an unexpected disruption of the cattle drive. It was a scheduled variable. You planned around it the way you planned around river crossings and weather. And after the water, the food, the cattle drive, diet was not a choice. It was a constraint imposed by distance, by supply chains that were inconsistent at best, and by the economics of an industry that kept wages low enough that the men doing the work had no leverage to demand better conditions. What a cowboy ate on a drive was what the cook had, and what the cook had was determined by what had survived the journey from the last supply point, which was often considerable distance behind them. Hardtack was the foundation. Flour, water, salt, pressed into squares so dense they could survive months in a supply wagon without spoiling, which tells you something important about their relationship to actual food. You soak them in coffee to soften them enough to chew without risk to your teeth, which were already suffering from everything else the diet was doing to them. Salt pork, dried beans cooked for hours over a fire until they were soft enough to eat, seasoned with whatever the cook had available, which was usually not much. Coffee strong enough to strip enamel, and nothing else. Nothing green, nothing fresh, nothing that had grown from the ground recently enough to still contain the nutrients a human body required to maintain itself over months of hard physical labor. The consequences were not abstract. Scurvy on the cattle trails was documented, recurring, and widely misunderstood by the men experiencing it. The symptoms arrived slowly enough that each individual development could be attributed to something else. The fatigue came first. You blamed the hours. The joint pain followed. You blamed the sleeping on the ground. Then the gums began to bleed when you pressed them. Then the teeth started to loosen in their sockets, slowly, incrementally, in a way that you could feel when you ran your tongue across them, and that you tried not to think about directly, because thinking about it directly required acknowledging something about your situation that you were not prepared to acknowledge. Then the teeth fell out. You were 23 years old, and your teeth were falling out, and nobody around you could tell you why, because nobody around you understood what was happening either. The connection between fresh food and scurvy, while known to maritime medicine by this period, had not entered the working knowledge of the average cattle drive operation. Men suffered from it without understanding it, attributed it to other causes, and kept riding because stopping was not something the cattle drive permitted. Now the cold. The winter of 1886 into 1887 is remembered in the history of the American cattle industry as the Great Die-Up. A series of blizzards moved across the northern Great Plains beginning in November and did not relent until spring. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero across vast stretches of Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. Snowdrifts buried fence lines. Water sources froze solid. My cattle that had been ranging on open grassland for months, with no shelter provisions because the summers had been mild, and the economics of the industry discouraged expenditure on infrastructure that good weather made seem unnecessary. Those cattle died. Somewhere between 50 and 90% of the open range cattle in the affected regions perished. But before the cattle died, the cowboys assigned to watch them were out in it, riding in 40 below temperatures on horses that were themselves struggling to survive, wearing whatever they had, which was rarely adequate for conditions that severe, because the clothing available to a cowboy on a $30 monthly wage was not designed for the extreme end of the plains winter. Frostbite took fingers, it took toes, it took ears and the tips of noses. Men who got lost in whiteout conditions, and whiteout conditions on the northern plains in a severe blizzard were total directional orientation becoming impossible within minutes of the visibility dropping, simply didn't come back. They were found in spring, sometimes close to where they had become disoriented, sometimes miles away. The cold had taken them so efficiently that the finding of them in spring was sometimes almost peaceful in appearance. Men sitting against fence posts or lying in draws, preserved by the same cold that had killed them, looking less dead than simply stopped. After the cold, the heat. Kansas in July was a different kind of assault. The temperature in the cattle towns during peak summer regularly exceeded 100 degrees. There was no shade worth mentioning on the main streets. The buildings trapped heat. The unpaved streets reflected it upward. The cattle in the stockyards generated it biologically in quantities that added measurably to the ambient temperature of the surrounding blocks. Heat exhaustion was common and was not recognized as a medical condition requiring treatment. A man who collapsed from heat was told to drink water and get back to work. The water available in most cattle towns was warm, metallic, and almost certainly contaminated in ways that made drinking large quantities of it a transaction with uncertain outcomes. Heat stroke. The progression of heat exhaustion past the point where the body can regulate its own temperature. Killed without much warning. A man would seem merely tired, then confused. Then he would stop being able to answer questions coherently, and then he would be on the ground, and if someone didn't get him into shade and cool down within a narrow window of time, he would die from a core body temperature that had exceeded the threshold his brain could survive. There was no treatment protocol. There was whatever the people around him thought to do, which varied considerably. Then the horses. This one doesn't get discussed because it doesn't have the dramatic weight of disease or weather. But the relationship between a cowboy and his horse was the most operationally critical and physically dangerous element of daily life on the frontier, and the dangers it produced were constant and largely invisible in the historical record, because they were so ordinary that nobody thought to write them down. Falling from a horse killed men, not in dramatic circumstances, in routine ones. A horse that stepped in a prairie dog hole, a horse spooked by a snake, a horse that stumbled crossing a river in high water. Men who fell badly, in places where there was no help nearby from injuries that would be survivable with immediate treatment, died because immediate treatment was not available, and the distances involved made any treatment a matter of hours rather than minutes. Being thrown and dragged was worse. A foot caught in a stirrup during a fall put a man in contact with the ground at the speed the horse was moving, which on a working cattle drive was not fast, but was fast enough. The injuries produced were not the clean dramatic wounds of fiction. They were the complicated multiple system injuries of a body bounced across hard ground at speed. And they happened in places where the nearest person with any medical knowledge was potentially days away. The mines were different from the trail, but no less efficient. The gold rush pulled hundreds of thousands of men into the mountains and deserts of California and later Nevada, Colorado, and across the West into underground environments that the human body was not designed to occupy for 8 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for years at a time. The air underground carried things. Stone dust was a slow one. Silica particles from the rock, released by drilling and blasting, small enough to pass through the body's initial defenses and lodge in the deep tissue of the lungs. Silicosis, the progressive replacement of functional lung tissue with scar tissue, took years to develop and was impossible to treat when it arrived. A miner who had spent 5 years underground might walk away from the work feeling functional and spend the next decade dying by inches from what he had breathed in during those 5 years. There was no warning. There was no test. There was just the cough that developed slowly and the shortness of breath that followed slowly and the progressive narrowing of what a man could do physically as his lungs lost the capacity to do what lungs are for. Mine collapses were the fast version, rock that had been assessed as stable and wasn't, timbers that had been placed and had shifted, a section of shaft that had been worked past the point where the surrounding geology could support it. The collapse itself was instantaneous. The warning, if there was one, was measured in seconds at most. Men caught in collapses were either killed immediately by the falling rock or trapped in the darkness with whatever air remained in the section, and the speed of the rescue determined whether the trapped men were recovered alive or recovered. Dynamite accidents were constant and were treated as routine costs of the operation. The explosives used in frontier mining were not the stable modern compounds of later periods. Nitroglycerin-based blasting agents were sensitive to heat, to shock, to the handling of men who were tired at the end of a long shift, and perhaps not as careful as they had been at the start of it. Premature detonations happened. Men were killed close, and men were killed at distances that seemed safe. The mathematics of who survived a dynamite accident on a given day had less to do with skill or attention than with where exactly you were standing when something went wrong. And through all of it, the water and the food and the cold and the heat and the horses and the mines, there was the medicine, or rather, the absence of it. The nearest doctor might be 40 miles away, and traveling those 40 miles in time to matter required conditions, weather, a functioning horse, consciousness, that were not always available. When you reached the doctor, what he had to offer was constrained by a medical science that was, in the 1870s and 80s, genuinely primitive by any subsequent standard. Infection was not understood in any way that produced effective treatment. Light wound care was performed with instruments and in conditions that introduced as much bacteria as they removed. Amputation was the standard response to serious limb injuries, not because surgeons preferred it, but because it was the best available option in a world where the alternative was watching infection spread through a body that had no pharmaceutical defense against it. The surgery itself was performed without anesthesia in many cases, or with whatever the local supply of ether or chloroform allowed, which was variable, on men who were already weakened by blood loss and shock, in rooms that were not sterile in any meaningful sense of the word, with instruments that had not been sterilized in any meaningful sense of the word. Survival rates reflected all of this honestly. The average life expectancy on the frontier was somewhere in the mid-40s. If you reached 50, you had beaten odds that most of the men around you had not. The weathered old cowboy of the movies, the experienced hand who had seen everything and survived it all and was now dispensing wisdom from a porch somewhere, was a statistical rarity. Most of the men who went west didn't get old. They got used up. Quietly, invisibly, without drama or documentation, in the service of an industry that needed their bodies and replaced them when those bodies gave out, the way you replace any tool that has been worked past its useful life. The gun was not the story. The gun was the distraction. The real story was a 20-year-old from Ohio, drinking from a creek outside Dodge City because he was thirsty and the creek looked clean. A 30-year-old miner in Bodie with a cough that had been getting worse for 2 years and showed no sign of stopping. A cowboy in the Texas Panhandle in January of 1887, riding into a blizzard because the cattle needed to be found and nobody else was going to find them. These men didn't make it into the mythology. They made it into ledgers, into numbers, into the anonymous statistical background of a period that the culture chose to remember through its exceptions rather than its realities. But they were the reality. They were most of it. And the thing that killed them wasn't fast or loud or dramatic enough to put on a screen. It was just relentless, just constant, just the West doing what the West did to the people who went there, believing a story that had been written by people who needed them to go. The bullet was the exception. Everything else was the rule.